Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, March 20th, 2026. I'm your host, Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. This week on the show, we're joined by journalist and author Jowita Bydlowska. Bydlowska sits down with Rabble publisher Sarah Sahagian to discuss her latest memoir, Unshaming, and to reflect on how her 2014 memoir, Drunk Mom, transformed her life. Here they are in conversation. Take a listen.
Well, welcome to Rabble Radio. It's so nice to interview you. I'm sure so many of our listeners have read Drunk Mom. I mean, your incredibly successful memoir that was published. When I was in my 20s, I remember reading it because at the time I was actually studying motherhood for my PhD. And it was such a gorgeous memoir. And I was actually specializing in motherhood memoirs. And it really, really struck a chord with me. And I remember going to see Lena Dunham speak when she was on tour in Toronto. And I remember her mentioning she was reading it too. So one of those rare motherhood memoirs that really transcends the space. I didn't have kids yet. Lena didn't have kids. And we were all reading it. So let's just start at the beginning of your career. So when you wrote your first memoir, what were you trying to accomplish when you got into memoir writing? I know you've been a writer for your whole life, but when you felt the call to write that memoir, can you explain a little bit what that moment with the first memoir felt like?
Sure. Yeah. Great question. And the reason why I became a writer is mostly because when I moved to Canada, I didn't speak English. So it was a way for me to, converse with the world or communicate. And I find that's quite a common experience, especially with people who are immigrants and write in English. But so I did always write, and I always wanted to be a fiction writer. I was reading fiction. I was interested in fiction. So Drunk Mom was originally written as fiction. And the reason for that is twofold. One, that was something I was already doing and practicing. And two, I was in denial about what was happening in my life. And, specifically doing something really terrible while also doing something quite beautiful, which was, being a new mom and taking care of the baby. And I struggle so tremendously with this sort of, double life, here's the baby that it's completely dependent on me. I'm obsessed with him. Like I was, I talk about it in Drunk Mom, how I was like into motherhood from the first ultrasound, like seeing the dots on the screen. And I was like, that's my baby right there. So there's that. And then at the same time, I'm really struggling with this demon that's like my companion as much as the baby. Right. So yeah. And then, this is just to say that it wasn't a conscious motivation to write a memoir, but I wanted to write about this experience, and I wanted to do it through fiction because I needed the wall between this is not my experience, but of course it was.
I'm curious, when did that change? When did it become a memoir? When did it go from fiction piece to memoir? And did you make that decision, or did someone suggest that to you?
Oh yeah, so it was suggested by my agent, and strictly because we were also friends. And he said, how's it going? Here's this book that we're working on, and I said, by the way, this is all a true story. So it was just a conversation. He said, do you want to turn it into a memoir? And he just thought it would be, good idea for a number of reasons. But I never wanted to be exposed. I wanted to be very anonymous. I wanted to be, that's what I knew that writers were. And I'm quite shy and introverted. But he had this idea that, this would help a lot of people. There's probably people like you out there. Everybody's struggling with one thing or another, and it's a taboo subject. So I think, in retrospect, what he was not saying, but saying was, this is something that's going to sell better. So he was probably cynical about it. And what appealed to me was this idea that I would be able to communicate and possibly find other women like me, and not just women, but men too, but other mothers like me, because it was such an isolating experience, sort of doubly isolating, the motherhood and then the drinking, which is, already secrecy. And then after that, Yeah, I had a conversation with my publisher. I think there were two conversations about what it would mean to be that exposed, and I went into it very naively. Like, I just thought it would be, oh, I didn't think it would be cute. I just thought it would be very not what it was at all. Like, I didn't expect the sort of judgment and, the stigma that went along with it, I guess.
After you made that decision, then you're
Mhm.
on record forever. And I'm just curious, how did that
Mhm.
impact your life, right? Because combining your art with your life with a memoir is, I mean, especially
Mhm.
a memoir that was a memoir people actually read. I mean, a lot of people don't read most people's memoirs, right? Most memoirs stay obscure, but Drunk Mom was such a phenomenon. So many people read it, loved it, were inspired by it. As you said, how did that change the way you led your life?
So to be honest, I didn't think highly of it. And this is interesting. Somewhere along the line, and I think it was some men that said those things to me, women's writing, especially memoir, was sort of confessional, less serious. It was, very feminine energy. You write about yourself and being a mom because you can't write about issues, So there was this and I guess that was internalized in me. So I certainly felt that, that I wasn't serious. So even right now, when you said, when you combine yourself with your art, like it took me a really long time to get to the point where I thought it was art and it was something creative that I could be proud of. Because there was this weird feeling that, oh, maybe it's sensational because it's because it's such an unusual topic and it's provoking, etc. And I do remember very secretly feeling really upset when I would read reviews, even if they were negative and saying, mean things about my appearance or whatever. I just felt so heartbroken that no one was commenting on the prose because I thought, I think this is written in an interesting way, especially because my English was not even fluent at that time. So I used I had quite a limited vocabulary, and that helped me to develop a certain style. And I thought, wow, no one's commenting on it. And then people did eventually. But and then this idea that it was going to be out there, as you say, in a world forever, I'm very happy about that now. But at the time, there were quite a number of articles and blog posts written about, what is my son going to think? And there was one particular journalist, quite a popular journalist, who said, oh, this is, one of those books that I'm going to be ostracized on a playground. And I'm like, I'm not just harming myself, I'm harming my son. I was called exhibitionistic. I was called, navel gazing. Like, and, as much as I want to say I have very thick skin and it didn't get to me, that it did get to me for sure. Even though, outwardly I had to be like, yeah, that's cool, whatever. I don't care. But I did care, like, a lot.
I remember actually mentioning you in an article I wrote about memoirs. And it was interesting because I was writing an article about Anna Faris's memoir that she wrote about a decade ago. So she was married to Chris Pratt. She wrote a memoir that came out right after they announced their divorce, but she had written it clearly while they were still married, and their marriage seemed pretty happy in the book. And so I was talking about how bizarre it must be because a memoir is a time capsule. So it's true at the time,
Mhm.
and then you keep living your life. The trajectory of your life changes. The end point of the memoir would change, but you have to submit it at some
Yeah.
point. So it doesn't mean that memoir, that snapshot was invalid, but it's so
Mhm.
bizarre because it shows you how ephemeral it is, right? And I actually mentioned it, and I said, so when your life would change or when Mary Carr's
Mhm.
life would change, we don't necessarily know, right? Because it's only
Yeah.
because she's married to a movie star and she was a famous
Yeah.
actress that we knew that there was going to be something different in the sequel. And so
Yeah.
now you have effectively written a sequel to Drunk Bum. So
Yeah, by accident.
yeah, and so you're updating us on your life. So can you tell us, how is this memoir different from Drunk Mom? I know it's probably different in so many different
Yeah,
ways, but it
yeah,
would be hard to answer that
yeah.
question. But what would you say are the main differences when you think of this book compared to the first one?
Sure, yeah. Like in terms of form, I love this observation because like as you said, Drunk Mom is happens in 11, it's a 11-month sort of slice of
Mhm,
life. And again, like you have to be so selective deciding what you're going to put in a story. Like
mhm.
like people had so many questions about my partner at the time, like where was he, what was he doing, etc. Like, especially it would come up in interviews, and I just remember being very not like quite defensive, and I would be like, I gave you enough. This is what you're getting, and that's it. Like because that is the thing. Like it's the entity. So then unshaming is interesting because one of the things that I really struggled with in private life was that I believed that I had some kind of responsibility to my readers, specifically readers of Drunk Mom, especially the people who wrote to me and said that it helped them to get sober, it helped them to feel less isolated. And, meanwhile, I'm not doing so well in my private life. And I don't know. It's just, again, another internalized belief where I thought, oh my God, I'm disappointing all these people. If they only knew, and this is sort of where the shame part came in for me. And it just was this constant companion of this being a hypocrite, essentially, right? Because I'm still doing interviews. Like, even, I don't know, last year I did an interview about Drunk Mom. So there's this, like, it just exists, like it's this monster out in the world that, like, I have to reconcile with all the time, and frequently talking about sobriety while I'm, like, I don't know, possibly hungover. Like, just, it was so absolutely, like, surreal that I just didn't know how to live with it. And then Unshaming, again, it was similarly with Drunk Mom. It was supposed to be something else entirely. It was supposed to be a book on shame because people did talk to me about shame. It is, I believe, something that lies at the core of addiction and a lot of self-harming behaviors in general, but not necessarily self-harming. Like, you can still have shame if somebody does something to you, of course. But so I was very interested in writing about that topic, just sort of in a general way. And once I, sat down to it and I did some interviews, some research, and I thought, that it's so huge that there's no way for me to be able to say anything definitive unless I sort of look at it from an internal lens and offer my shame, not in any way to, like, sacrifice myself or whatever. But I thought the trajectory of Drunk Mom is such a fascinating thing because, as you said, like, you close the book, memoir's over, but people are still curious. They still ask, are you sober? How's your son? Blah, 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 And I remember reading one particular memoir in which I looked up the writer immediately and found out that she relapsed shortly after publishing. And I felt so disappointed, cheated. I was like, I gave you attention and money or whatever it was to, absorb your book. And there you are going and living your life not the way I want you to, right? So I certainly thought, if I'm going to present this other story, that's going to really, it's not only going to disappoint people, but it's also going to maybe scare them even to thinking, like, okay, if she relapsed after all that public sort of declaration of sobriety, like, what chance do I have, But again, like with Drunk Mom, it's a very specific personal experience. And yeah, and I also just, similarly to Drunk Mom, I also wanted to write a book that I was sort of looking for and couldn't find. So I do have to say, Elizabeth Warsaw has a book that deals with relapse. I think it's called Again, and I think it's about crystal meth or whatever her substance was. So I don't want to say, oh, there was no books about relapse, but there were very few about relapse because, again, relapse doesn't lend itself to the neat story arc that we love, right? There's no beginning, middle, and the end. And you're like, okay, and then she did it again and again and again and again 20 times. Like, people are not very patient, and we do love happy endings. So I don't know.
We do, but it's interesting because relapse, I mean, anybody who's ever been to a recovery group knows relapse is part of recovery. And so, and that's a thing we talk about, which is funny because when it comes to mental health, we kind of act like you're either cured or somehow the last victory doesn't count at all. When it comes to something like cancer, if you had a reoccurrence of cancer, no one would say, oh, your last cancer battle, you lied about it, right? Or you cheated us because you have cancer again, right? Yeah. And I'm not trying to make light of cancer.
No.
I mean, but also alcohol use disorder is it's a health issue, right? So it's just interesting the way we still have these double standards for mental health that we don't have, thank goodness, for physical health.
Well, I think because there's some belief, and I have caught myself having that belief, that mental health is up to choice, that there's still this, it's not that we don't believe in genetics, but people who are, mentally unwell look like the people who are mentally well. And cancer is something you can often see, and it's like there's the evidence, and, it's a very biologically determined illness, but yeah, you're right, and both are, so it's not a wrong comparison, and I'm not comparing, but both are lifestyle diseases, right? So you could argue certain cancers happen because of something that you're doing, which is a choice again, right? And same with drinking or like having toxic relationships, eating disorders, all these things are seemingly up to us to control and to like recover from. But how the hell do you do it in a vacuum? And especially when you have something like crushing shame and like it's
It's funny because you wrote Drunk Mom before anyone was really questioning the mommy drinking culture that was on the rise, right? And then, I mean, sort of 5 years later, there were a lot of op-eds. So I actually think a lot of people might have read your book and started thinking about how the culture really normalized this. And I remember even at my baby shower, someone gave us an LCBO gift certificate because they said the only way to get through parenthood is to drink. And I sort of thought, I mean,
absolutely.
and this person did not know me well. And I thought, what if I'd had a drinking problem? I mean, my husband and I are not big drinkers, but I sort of thought, it's a really insensitive gift. Or what if,
Yeah.
anyway, so many reasons why that's an insensitive gift.
And I
It's
wanted to say
really-
that another book came out when mine did, with and also Johnson, who I think she's quite connected to. So she was she really sort of pioneered this conversation about women and drinking specifically, and motherhood as well. But yeah, no, it's oh my God, the mommy drinks because you cry culture is
or like even there was a study that wrongly concluded wine was good for you, which I remember 10 years ago people citing, and then it turned out that the analytics of the study were really bad. Actually, it was just that wealthier people drink more wine and they live longer for lots of other reasons to do with
exactly. Yeah.
Has nothing to do. Wine is not actually good for you. It's not like green.
But
juice.
I'm sure I read that at some point, and I was like, well, this is what happened. How I relapsed. Like I even talk about it in Drunk Mom. We had a party, and people brought alcohol. Of course they did, right? This is what you bring to celebrate. And then I just suddenly looked around the room, and everyone was drinking, and I thought this is perfectly normal. And someone more than one person said, you deserve this, and you went through labor, 27 hours of labor. Like I definitely felt that no one was forcing me to do it, but I definitely felt people trying to normalize it and just to make it like, and they still do. We were laughing recently because a couple of people showed up for the launch of Unshaming, and everyone was remembering that they had wine at my launch for Drunk Mom. So we don't know who brought it in, but it was there. And it was just like, oh, the irony.
Well, yeah, it is really ironic. And I think now we've maybe gotten to a place where you could have a sober book launch and people wouldn't mutiny, but I think we got there really recently. So I just wanted to ask you a couple more questions about this book and your process. So you were writing about shame. You decided to focus on your own experiences with shame. Did you find that actually helped you get through your own shame? Do you feel like you're in a different place with your relationship to shame now as compared to when you started writing the book?
Yeah. So you know what? I used to get this question a lot with Drunk Mom, like, did you find it cathartic? And I would be like, that is absolutely preposterous, because I didn't. I found it very like self-harming to extent. And then I was again defensive, and I was like, no, it was great. But with Unshaming, I mean, I don't want to be too like cheesy about it, but it is a form of experiment. I call my readers my witnesses, because the whole idea of Unshaming is, sharing it with another person to make it smaller, right? So yeah, on a personal level, it was very liberating. I mean, like, listen, when you're a writer, like, it's just you and the book, right? Like, so you really dictate what happens in it. You cannot dictate people's reactions, right? So you cannot manipulate them as much as you want to. That's not going to happen. So, but I certainly felt that I said so much in this book that maybe wasn't, some people may not be shocking, but it was really, really difficult to talk about. And I had this one sort of method, which was like, if it hurts, write about it. Obviously not everything, but a couple of things that I wanted to write about. So there's incident with my dog, etc. Like I was just like, I really needed this book to bleed, God, that's so dramatic. Very Eastern European of me, but I really did. And because it did make things a lot smaller, a lot easier. And I'm not gonna say, oh, and then I was just liberated and I have no shame. I'm completely shameless. And that's not true. Listen, like when I was doing audiobook, I had to read it out loud, sort of, so A, I was self-conscious about my accent, but B, there was like so funny because I don't know why I'm stuck on you mentioning eating disorders, but there's a one part in my book where I admit to knowing that I'm attractive or something, or that like, there was this pressure with appearance, and my particular bottom being that, I was always worried that I was going to break my face, and it happened. So, and then I was reading it out loud, and I was so freaking embarrassed. I was like, I can't believe I'm saying this out loud. Like, because I'm not Gen Z. I'm not I don't have an Instagram with my influencer ass on it or whatever. Like I'm 48. Like I'm not going to be like, but I had to talk about that too, because there was shame attached to it. But then when I read it, I was like, I don't think I'm over that one yet. Like, I don't think I was ready to say that. And it was so interesting that was out of all the things that were in the book, really dark things. That was the one that made me feel like, I don't want to say it. Like, this is so embarrassing. So there's definitely places where I cringe very, very hard. And I don't like that people ask me right now if I'm sober or how my recovery is. That bugs me. It's a one day at a time thing.
So do you think you would ever write another memoir? Because now you've written 2 very raw memoirs. Would you say that you're more likely to write one, or do you think you need another long break?
Would I write a third? Absolutely, I would. And this is the one memoir I'm going to write that is going to be written with intention. So I was joking like, oh, I need to have a trilogy, and I absolutely don't. So somebody else made a joke. They're like, what if you relapse again? Is it going to be called Shamed Again? I mean, it lends itself to many different, but I'm very interested, and I think this is going to be quite an adventure. I'm interested in writing about what it's like to be in a relationship with an addict, not just romantic relationship, but being a loved one, etc. So I'm certainly circling that idea, and this again would be the first memoir that I would write with every intention of it being a memoir. So it may not work, because maybe I can only get in there accidentally, but I think my last novel, called Monster, I called it autofiction because I wrote about some very, very like real things that happened in my life and real thoughts that I had. And I wrote about a toxic relationship that was, absolutely devastating in my life. And I fictionalized the hell out of it. But, I kind of did. I have 3 memoirs, I guess, but one with intention will be the next one.
Well, it was such a pleasure to talk to you today. I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours. Congratulations on the book. Congratulations on Unshaming. Where can our listeners find it? If they want to check it out, where can they get a copy?
They should get a copy at their local indie store, because they really need our support. Before they go into other places which I don't have to name. We know
the other options, but thank you very much. And there is also an audiobook, so I assume
absolutely. Oh yeah, and I want to recommend that because this is probably the rawest thing I've ever done, because I compared it to reading your grade 11 diary out loud to the boy that you really like. That was the feeling. Or girl, whatever, like to the person they had a huge crush on, and you're reading your utmost, like your worst poetry ever. So that's how it felt. So that I think that's contained in the audiobook, but I recommend it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely.
And I hope that everyone goes and checks out Unshaming.
Thank you.
That was author Jowita Bydlowska and Rabble publisher Sarah Sahagian. Thanks so much for that, Jowita and Sarah. And now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. To do that, let's hand things over to Rabble editor Nick Seabrook. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. Starting this week with national news. On Monday, March 23rd, the Supreme Court of Canada will be taking up a case that will examine the limits of the Constitution's Notwithstanding Clause. The Notwithstanding Clause allows provincial and federal governments to pass laws and shield them from court challenges if those laws violate the Constitution or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And any law shielded by the Notwithstanding Clause has to be renewed every 5 years. In recent years, the Notwithstanding Clause has been used more often to shield laws that have been enacted to end labor strikes or legislation that restricts the rights of the trans community. In Quebec, the government of Premier François Legault used the Notwithstanding Clause to prevent Law 21 from being challenged in court. Law 21 bans public employees from wearing religious symbols, a clear violation of charter rights protecting freedom of expression and religious beliefs. Among the questions the Supreme Court will be considering are whether judges can still rule on whether a right was violated even if they cannot strike down the law, whether invoking the clause could violate unwritten constitutional principles, and whether courts should be able to determine if repeatedly using the clause to protect a law effectively eliminates the right it is meant to override entirely. Staying with national news, a coalition of artists, writers, and other creatives have issued an open letter to Prime Minister Mark Carney calling on him to condemn the U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran. It has been 2 weeks since the U.S. and Israel began bombing targets in Iran, which included an all-girls school, an attack that led to the deaths of nearly 200 people. In that time, Prime Minister Carney both celebrated U.S. actions while also calling them inconsistent with international law. The Prime Minister has also not ruled out the possibility of Canadian forces getting involved in the conflict. In their letter, the signees demanded the following, quote, "We demand that the Government of Canada take a position in all international fora against the expansionist and warmongering actions of the U.S. and Israel and their stated plan for regime change through massive death and destruction in Iran." End quote. And finally, writer Linda McQuaig argues that Ontario Premier Doug Ford's approach to post-secondary education is a perfect example of why Canada needs a wealth tax. Ford recently introduced changes to the province's student loan program, where once the program primarily provided grants to students, now more of the money offered will be loans that will have to be paid back. This means that many students from low-income families will no longer be able to access higher education, creating inequality with wealthier families who can afford the increased costs. McQuaig argues that programs like education and healthcare could be better funded through a wealth tax, which would ensure that these programs remain accessible to all, rich and poor. And as always, you can read the full version of all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. To help support our show, please visit rabble.ca/donate, subscribe to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, and now join us over on Patreon for special bonus content. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca. Thank you to Carl Narenberg for supplying the music, and thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and we'll talk to you next week.